If you've been competing in homebrew competitions for any length of time, you may have come across a score sheet like this. Good beer? That's it? What's so good about it? And if it's so good, why did I only get a 29? If you've judged a homebrew comp, please tell me you haven't turned in a sheet like this. There are do's and don'ts for score sheets, and there are some nevers too. So let's get judgy about score sheets. If you're going to tell a good score sheet from a bad one, you first need to know a little about the sections and what they're all used for. If you've been competing or judging for any time, you may know all this, so feel free to skip ahead. But if you're new to the game, let's take a quick peek at what's going on and what it all means. First off, in the upper left-hand corner, we've got the spot for your name, judge ID number, and your email address. This is so the entrant knows who judged their beer. And if they have any questions, they can contact you via the email you use for your BJCP judging. A quick note that I didn't know the first time I judged: if you're a provisional judge or rank pending, you don't have a BJCP ID number yet, so don't sweat it when filling this out. Also, most competitions will give you a sheet of Avery address labels with your information all typed up. Take a few minutes before judging round starts and either fill this section out for all the beers in your flight or put those handy-dandy labels on. While you're pre-filling those sheets, make sure you mark what judge rank you are if you have one. Last, pre-check any qualifications you may have. If you're going through a sensory training program, mark that. If you're a Cicerone, make sure to check what rank you are for this as well. It helps the entrant know how knowledgeable you may be and what kind of training you've undergone to be able to give feedback. As you evaluate the beer, you may come across some specific sensory descriptors. Make sure to check the boxes here along the left as you do. These also help if you're a little shaky on what each off flavor or sensory descriptor you're getting might be called. Note that some of these descriptors are flaws in some styles, but acceptable in others. Like you want lots of esters and phenolics in a Belgian style, but not in an American lager. The other half of the score sheet is where you'll be writing out all your perceptions of the beer as it's judged. First off, at the very top is where you will fill in what category and subcategory you're judging. Below that is the space to write in what the subcategory number is referring to. An example would be 16B Oatmeal Stout. Below that is the bottle description section. Bottle description doesn't account for any points, but it can be an indicator of what's to come. If the bottle is short-filled, you might expect some staling or oxidation characteristics. If the cap is rusty and gross, it can be an indicator that this brewer may not follow the strictest sanitation policies. You could also be proven wrong about these things, but it's good to note and have in mind as you sample the beer. In the comments, make sure to write something. If everything looks good, simply write appropriate fill/appearance, and maybe note the cap color. This can help the entrant know that yes, this is indeed their beer you've judged. It doesn't happen often, but human beings are involved in the process, and a bottle can sometimes get mislabeled. Now let's get to the reason we all came here: how this beer sizes up against the BJCP guidelines. In the aroma section, you'll note how the beer smells. If you notice, it says right next to each category, as appropriate to style. This means, according to the BJCP guidelines, does this beer have the aroma notes that are supposed to be there for the style that this beer was entered under? A little tip from the new judge: all the things you need to look for are noted under each of the sensory section headings. So here we want to note any malt, hop, and ester aromas, as well as anything else we may come across. Note the good stuff, as well as the not-so-good things you get while smelling the beer. Aroma counts for 12 of the 50 overall points for the beer's score. For appearance, we're noting how the beer looks: color, clarity, and the head retention, its color and texture as well. Appearance is only 3 points of the 50, but as one of the instructors for my sensory training class calls it, this is the easiest 3 points you'll ever get. The best part: flavor. How does this beer taste? There's a lot to make note of, and other than the overall impression, this section has the most lines to fill. If you notice, you're looking for more than just the malt and hop flavors. What kind of fermentation character do you notice? Is it clean and appropriate to style? Or do you pick up some weird things like butter or pumpkin or sour apple? Other fermentation things to look for are esters and phenolics, like the banana and clove found in Hefeweizen. Think about how all these flavors work together. Are they balanced and everyone is holding hands and singing? Or does one just kind of jump out and take over the whole show? Also consider how the flavor lingers or doesn't linger. Lots to consider and lots to mention here. This is the section that carries the most weight too. 20 out of 50 points. Almost half your score lies here. Mouthfeel is just like it sounds. How does the beer feel in your mouth as you taste it? Is it full and fluffy, or is it thin and watery? How is the carbonation? Is it real sparkly, or is it just kind of flat? Also note any creaminess or lack thereof, and any astringency. Astringency is the feeling you get if you were to suck on a tea bag. Now, who really sucks on tea bags, though? Weirdos. It kind of hits you in the back of your mouth and in the hinge of your jaw, and it has a drying effect. Again, good for some styles in the right amount, but really bad for others. Mouthfeel gets a 5-point weight on your overall score. The overall impression section is where you take all that you've found in the beer and give your final analysis of the entry. It's also where you give the entrant any feedback on how they could improve this beer. Because let's face it, a 35-point beer could always become a 42, and also a 45-point beer could become a 48, or that holy grail, a 50-point world-class example of style. These last 10 points make up the full 50 possible for an entry. Right below, there's a space for you to add up all the points from all the sections and give the final score for the entry. Another tip for you, double check your math and make sure you have the right score. If it's wrong, the steward will bring the sheet back and ask you to redo it, so bring a calculator or use the one on your phone, just to spite that 5th grade math teacher who said, "You know, you're not going to be walking around with a calculator in your pocket all the time." But wait, we're not done with this sheet yet. This is the part of the sheet I have to really remember to fill out, to be honest. I can't help it. I just get excited about discussing the sample with my judging partner. At the very bottom, there are 2 more sections that need to be filled out before we're all done. At the bottom left is the scoring guide. Just take your final score and circle the section it falls under. This helps indicate that you are aware of how your score falls from not good all the way to classic example of style. It's also a good double check for you before you hand in your sheet. Is this beer really a 38? Is it really an excellent example? Adjust your score if you need to, and circle what fits. But Brian, what if this thing tastes like an old sock dipped in toxic waste and smells like Bigfoot's toe jam? If the beer is just totally undrinkable and full of flaws, it's kind of an understood rule that you give it what we call a courtesy score of 13. In the lower right section, there are some checkboxes for you to mark how close or how far this entry came to being a perfect example of style. This is a bit more subjective. Take into consideration what score you gave the beer as well as what you thought of it. Is it a classic example? Maybe just missed the mark? Was it flawless, or did it have some serious things going wrong with it? And overall, was it a wonderful beer, or is it just kind of lifeless and unenjoyable? Mark those boxes, and then you're done. Okay, so now that we're better acquainted with the different sections, let's look at what would be considered a bad score sheet before we cover the proper way to fill one out. First of all, in this example of what I would call the worst ever score sheet, there's hardly anything written on this thing. Look at the appearance section. Just checks on the descriptors. I actually got a score sheet like this once. No lie. And those descriptors are terrible. Lots of dark malts? What's that supposed to mean? He mentions the beer is thin and hoppy, both not what you want in an oatmeal stout, but doesn't tell me how to fix this at all. And for overall impression, I get good beer and a score of 29. Well, that is in the good score range, but I have no idea how to make this beer any better. And last, my personal pet peeve, I can hardly read this guy's writing. I mean, it doesn't have to be calligraphy, but come on, man, somebody else has got to read this thing. So first of all, here are my list of Scoresheet Don'ts. Don't use bland and generic descriptors. Words like some, good, malty, hoppy don't fully tell what you perceive. Don't mention flaws without giving feedback. If there's a way to prevent the flaws that you perceive, then tell the entrant what those are. Don't assume process, ingredients, or methods. You were not there when this beer was brewed or packaged. Don't assume because you sense diacetyl that they need to boil at a higher temperature. Don't assume because there's a bunch of esters that they need to ferment at a specific temperature either. Don't assume, suggest. Now, here are the nevers. never go looking for faults. If you go looking for a fault, you'll always find it, even if it doesn't exist. Never leave the majority of the lines blank when filling in the sections. Those lines are there for a reason, so use them. And a small aside here, when you're taking your tasting exam, they expect those lines to be filled in for each section. Give the entrant the feedback they deserve. Never mention a flaw without giving feedback. Again, don't assume anything, but if you sense a fermentation flaw, suggest that they look into what causes that flaw and evaluate their process. Never provide useless feedback. Just writing good beer and calling it a day is completely unacceptable. And last, never write illegibly. As was noted in the instructions for my tasting exam, handwriting is to be read, not deciphered. Feel free to drop a comment below and tell me your Scoresheet nightmare story. Or, do you have a pet peeve on Scoresheet feedback or lack of? Let me know in the comments below. Now that we've seen the wrong way to do it, let's take a look at what you should be doing for a good Scoresheet. Write legibly, no cursive, and don't abbreviate. You might know what you mean, but somebody else might not get your abbreviations. Fully fill out each section. Use those lines and write down everything you experience from the beer. Use specific descriptors. When you use better words than good or malty, it's easy to fill those lines up. Instead of just malty, use something that describes that malt character, like freshly baked bread or dark roast coffee. Instead of hoppy, try to describe the hop character. Is it piney and resinous, or is it more fruity? And don't just write fruity, tell what kind of fruit you get. Orange, guava, pineapple, blackberry, snozberry, whatever you get, write it down. It doesn't have to be flowery and poetic, but be specific. Also, a couple BJCP judges mentioned to me that it's best to use common references when stating your observations. Like, don't use the phrase, smells like grandma's house. Your grandma's house may smell like gingerbread and vanilla. Somebody else's grandma's house may smell like cats and Marlboros. Better to go with smells like oatmeal cookies. Everyone knows what oatmeal cookies smell like. You're absolutely right. They smell like grandma's house. Along those lines, make sure when you quantify something to be specific in that as well. Good carbonation is not specific. Use the terms low, high, or medium, or moderate. If something is between low, middle, or high, then try to be as specific on that as well. I like using the phrase moderately low, which means something like not quite medium, but not quite low either. If a flaw is mentioned, you need to do two things. First, make sure you mention it in the overall impressions along with helpful feedback on how to avoid it in the future. Again, not assuming anything, but suggesting possible causes and solutions. Second, make sure to check its corresponding box in the descriptor definitions on the left. Make sure to offer constructive feedback. Remember the golden rule, don't be a dick. I like to use the method called the compliment sandwich. You say something positive, then you talk about the negative, then finish with another positive. That positive may only be something like, that's a real pretty beer right there. But make sure you say something that sets up the negative to be accepted for what it is, a helping hand. And lastly, judge the beer in the glass. Now what I mean by this is sometimes an entrant may enter a beer in the wrong category. I've actually had this happen to me in a competition. I entered what I thought was an English porter. According to the judges, it was more like an English brown. That being said, they had to judge that beer as an English porter. Make sure to mention in your feedback to consider entering it in a different category if you feel it would better fit there. But Brian, you might be saying, why is this so important? Why can't I just jot down some notes and get on to the next entry? I only have a few minutes per beer to judge. I can't be sitting here writing the great American novel for each one. Well, there's two reasons I can think of to answer that question. First, bad score sheets suck. It sucks to get a sheet with no feedback and just a seemingly random number for your beer. The second, and I think the most important, is that this person paid money to enter this competition. They spent hours designing a recipe and brewing this beer. They deserve your time to give them the best possible feedback on their entry. And you know, this could really turn someone off from competing again. Imagine if this was this person's first time entering a comp, and they got back our example of a bad score sheet, do you think they'd be real jazzed to enter another one? That person may never become a great brewer. But if you take a minute to give them useful feedback, you could possibly help create the next innovator in craft beer. At the very least, you'll help fuel their interest in the hobby, and heck, you may even be influencing a new judge. As new judges, it's our responsibility to do our best each time we sit down at the judging table and provide the best possible feedback for the folks entering the competition. So if you got a little something out of this video and want to give a little something back, go ahead and give that old like button a little taparoo. Stay judgy, my friend.